You've made it to week 12 of the fantasy football season, and that means you are in the playoff hunt. We're here to help you go all the way. I'm Jen Piacenti with Sports Illustrated, and joining me today is Sports Illustrated's senior fantasy analyst, Michael Fabiano. Fabs, it's time to get serious. We got to get to the playoffs and we got to win these leagues. So let's start off by talking about the quarterback position. Who should we be starting this week? I noticed on your list, there's someone that could even still be available on a lot of waiver wires.
Yeah, and that's Cam Newton, right? He was available in about half of leagues on Yahoo going into the week. And I'm thankful that he went back to Carolina because he's been very good. 5 touchdowns in his first 2 games. And one of those games, he wasn't even the starter. This week, he's got the Dolphins. They've allowed the 5th most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. So Cam Newton is a top 10 play. I also like Kirk Cousins. Admittedly, I was dead wrong about him last week. He had a huge game against the Green Bay Packers. I would play him as a low QB1 this week against the 49ers. Their defense has allowed the 9th most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks, including 6 who have scored 19 plus. I think this could be a high-scoring game. Kirk Cousins is a very nice option. I'm also starting Russell Wilson, yes, against Washington. I know there's risk-reward there, but it is a great matchup. And Jimmy Garoppolo in multi-quarterback leagues is a good play against the Vikings.
Yeah, I actually told someone to start Kirk Cousins over Russell Wilson last week, and then I crossed my fingers, and thankfully that worked out for the both of us. I like Kirk Cousins as a start this week, and I'm going to start him in our SI Invitational League. As far as who we're sitting, who should we keep on the bench this week?
Ryan Tannehill needs to be on the sidelines. I mean, he's been a massive disappointment this year. He's averaging 16.2 fantasy points per game. That is not getting it done. And he's got the Patriots. Is there a hotter defense in the National Football League right now than New England? They have been bananas good. In fact, they've allowed the fewest fantasy points per game to quarterbacks at home. 5.5 points per game allowed. And that's not a misprint in Stardom and Sid'em. It's absolutely correct. So Tannehill is a fade. And so is Matt Ryan. I mean, you look at the numbers and he's been awful. And then you look at the matchup and you think, wait a minute. Well, he's playing the Jaguars. I mean, that's not a bad matchup. In fact, look at the numbers lately, all right? They have held starting quarterbacks to under 16 fantasy points in each of their last 4 games, including Josh Allen, who scored just 9.6 points against them in week 9. So Matt Ryan, find your way to the bench. I'm also sitting Carson Wentz and Ben Roethlisberger against the Cincinnati Bengals. He has a really bad statistical trend in Cincinnati.
I really like that call about Ryan Tannehill. What a disappointment. We took him pretty high up in drafts, but now he may be without A.J. Brown, and that Titans team allowed 5 takeaways to Houston last week, so not trending in the right direction. Let's pivot over to the running back position. A couple of guys here I really like on this start list.
And let's start off with Antonio Gibson, who has been really hard to trust over the last few weeks. You know, last week, the numbers weren't great. The week before, he had a couple of touchdowns, but I'd start him against Seattle. This is a really good matchup. Their defense has allowed the 2nd most fantasy points per game. The running backs and 7 have scored 17-plus points against them. Gibson's also searing near a 40% touch share over the last 2 games, so keep the faith in him as an RB2. I also like Melvin Gordon in what? It's a revenge game against the Los Angeles Chargers. Their defense has given up the 9th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, including 8 backs who have scored 14 or more points. I'm also starting A.J. Dillon and Miles Sanders in a suddenly run-heavy Philadelphia offense.
It was sure fun to see Miles Sanders come back and reclaim a big piece of that run game. I think we all wanted to see that, and I love the Melvin Gordon revenge game call. If for DFS, I'm also starting Javonte Williams, and I think Javonte Williams is also a start. He's only like $5,700, very affordable. So I love those. As far as sitting running backs, Fabs, it's off week for Myles Gaskin, right?
Exactly. Right, it's week 12. 12 is an even number. Myles Gaskin stinks in even-numbered weeks. It's just crazy. He hasn't scored more than 8.6 points in an even-numbered week. Like, it's so stupid, this trend, but it also makes him, like, the easiest player to predict, and they've got Carolina this week, so that's not a good matchup. And I'm also going to sit Rhamondre Stevenson, and I think a lot of folks out there are wondering whether or not they should play him. I mean, if you play in a multiple flex league, then okay, I get it. But Damian Harris is still the starter, and at worst, okay, this is going to end up being a backfield committee where you see both of these guys splitting the touches. That's what we saw last week against Atlanta. And the Titans defense has actually been good against running backs. They've allowed the 4th fewest points to the position. So Stevenson is a fade for me. So is Alex Collins on Monday night against Washington. And then Mike Davis lost touches to Quadre Allison, who the Falcons just signed off the practice squad. Mike Davis at this point should be on the waiver wire, not even just on your bench.
I honestly don't know how anybody is starting Mike Davis at all at this point. And that Seattle backfield is just a mess. I don't really trust anyone there. So moving over to the wideout position, Brandon Aiyuk. Fabs.
He's back.
Can we trust it? Yeah.
Yeah, listen, I mean, 2 of his last 3 games, over 18 fantasy points. Over the last 4 games, he has played 88% of the offensive snaps. And he's kind of become the guy we thought he was going to be, right? I mean, he was a breakout candidate going into the season, had a ridiculously slow start that saw a lot of people put him on the waiver wire, but he's back. The Vikings have allowed the 7th most points per game to wide receivers lined out wide. So this is a smash spot for Brandon Aiyuk. And then, Elijah Moore has been one of the best wide receivers in fantasy football over the last 3 weeks. 2 games with over 27 fantasy points in that time. And he's got a very good matchup this week against the Texans. They have allowed the most fantasy points to receivers lined out wide. That's where Moore has run about 70% of his routes. Now, Zach Wilson being under center concerns me a little bit because he's quite erratic. But I'm thinking against the Texans, he can still get the job done. So Elijah Moore should be in play as a wide receiver 2 or flex. I also like another Moore, DJ Moore in Carolina, and Brandon Cooks, who let us down last week. I get it. But he is facing the Jets this week in what should be the worst game in the history of the National Football League.
Oh, I'm definitely starting Brandon Cooks this week. You also like Michael Pittman versus Tampa Bay, so I'm digging that as well. As far as who we're sitting, not feeling the love yet for Mr. OBJ in LA.
I don't believe in him. Like, call me a negative Nancy. I just don't believe in him. And he hasn't had a lot of time to gain a rapport with Matthew Stafford, right? I mean, he played minimally in their first game, so this will be his first game where he actually sees a full complement of snaps. But I don't love OBJ in this offense. Like, I get it. Robert Woods isn't there. I think he maybe needs a little time to marinate. Let's put it that way. It's still going to be Cooper Kupp who sees the majority of the targets, and Van Jefferson is also in the mix as well. And the matchup's not great. Now, you may think, wait a minute, Fabs, you're bananas, all right? You've been eating too much turkey. Look at what the Vikings did to the Packers last week. That was on the road. Their defense has allowed the 4th fewest fantasy points to wide receivers on the road. So road wide receivers have struggled at Lambeau Field. Just keep that in mind. I'm sitting OBJ. And then Courtland Sutton, who got paid, but I mean, the numbers have not been there, right? I mean, look at his totals. He hasn't scored more than 6 fantasy points in 3 straight games. The Chargers defense is very tough. They've given up 5 touchdowns and the 2nd fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. So unless you're really desperate for a flex, Sutton should be on the sidelines. I'm also going to fade Jarvis Landry and Kenny Galladay at this point. I probably will drop him. I'm done. I'm sick of him. He should have never left Detroit. Horrible signing by the Giants. As a Cowboys fan, I kind of appreciate it. But from a fantasy perspective, I'm done with Kenny G.
I'm with you. I have absolutely no Kenny G anywhere. And, interestingly, the Courtland, Sutton, and Tim Patrick deals, no disrespect to Teddy Bridgewater because I absolutely love him, but they do kind of make you wonder, are they locking up a receiving core? I don't know, for maybe Aaron Rodgers. Just, something to think about if you're in dynasty leagues. I don't know, maybe they're targets. All right, and let's move over to the tight end position, our favorite position every week. Got a couple of studs here that are healthy and playing, and I like it a lot.
Yeah, Rob Gronkowski, and this one's somewhat of a softball here, but a lot of folks didn't draft him to be their tight end 1. He was more of a high tight end 2. But he returned this past week against the Giants, scored 13.1 fantasy points. He's got a really good matchup against the Colts. They've allowed 6 touchdowns and the 6th most points per game to tight ends. So unless you have Darren Waller or Mark Andrews or a player of that caliber, Gronkowski should be in your lineup. And then Kyle Pitts, he's been a disappointment. I'm trying to give people encouragement and validation. If Kyle Pitts is watching this, which I'm sure he's not, hey, Kyle, the fantasy community is behind you, my friend. Let's just get the job done. And this week, he's got the Jaguars. They've allowed 5 touchdowns to tight ends, and 6 have scored at least 10 points against them, right? So Kyle Pitts, who has failed to score more than 9.2 fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games, I think he'll wake up this week against Jacksonville. At least let's hope he does, and give us a little Thanksgiving weekend love. I also like Noah Fant this week. And if you're desperate, I mean desperate, Evan Ingram's got a good matchup against the Eagles. Just saying, The matchup is right.
Yeah, you do have to be pretty desperate, but you know what? I'm kind of in that spot in a couple of leagues because I have a lot of players on bye for whatever reason this week. All right, and who are we sitting at the tight end position? Looks like we got a tight end that's kind of in a committee and a tight end that has been pretty studly for us for a few weeks now.
And let's start off, with Austin Hooper, who's gotten 12 targets and 21.8 points in his last 2 games. Like, that's pretty good for a tight end, right? But he's still in the tight end committee, and he's playing the Ravens. Now, keep this in mind. I get it. Like, the Ravens on paper look like they're bad against tight ends. They're actually not. They gave up 2 huge games, one to Travis Kelce and one to Darren Waller. Okay, we can forgive that, right? But look at what they've done against TJ Hawkinson or Mike Gesicki. Did you see what Cole Kmet did last week? Nothing. So I don't like this matchup for Austin Hooper. I don't trust any Browns pass catchers this week. And Tyler Conklin, who's been on and off, right? I mean, he had a couple of touchdowns 2 weeks ago. This past week, the numbers weren't there, but he has scored 10-plus points in 3 of his last 4 games. I just don't like the matchup against the Niners. They've only allowed 2 touchdowns and 9.3 points per game to opposing tight ends. And last week, Dan Arnold, who was maybe the hottest tight end in fantasy football this side of Travis Kelce, scored 0 points against that defense. I'm also going to sit Jared Cook and Gerald Everett.
Dan Arnold, though, someone I think probably we still need to have our eyes on now that there's no Jamal Agnew, our waiver wire hero, Fabs. I'm so disappointed. And also Adam Troutman we lost. So this position continues to be something to wade through every week, and that's why you're going to hit the subscribe button right now on this video so you never miss our start sit list with Michael Fabiano or my waiver wire videos that come out once a week. If you want all of Michael Fabiano's start sits for every single position, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, and defense, be sure to visit us at si.com/fantasy.